we should avoid incentives to retire early. And some legislation was introduced in the past, for instance, the pension starting from 63. To the extent that life expectancy increases, we need to work longer. There's no way around that.
Unproductive, uncompetitive, and bureaucratic. Germany, once the beacon of fiscal stability, has fallen behind economically. To talk about the policies needed to turn things around, I'm joined by Clemens Fuest. He's head of the Ifo Research Institute and, according to a recent ranking, Germany's most influential economist. Professor Fuest, welcome along. I want to begin today by looking at German industry. When you see announcements of job cuts at the likes of Volkswagen or Bosch or BASF, is it your instinct to say, OK, this is very unfortunate, but these are just market forces, let's trust them to do their thing? Or do you think, right, now is really the time for the government to intervene to save these jobs?
I think it's both, actually. It's true that the car industry is in transition towards, as we all know, towards electric vehicles. And that does mean, I'm afraid, that fewer value added will take place in Germany and Europe, simply because batteries are produced more easily in emerging economies, not so much in highly developed economies. So market forces imply there will have to be some adjustment. Market forces also imply there will have to be an adjustment in energy intensive sectors like the chemical industry. At the same time, we do have a decline in investment in Germany, which is across the board, really, not just in these sectors. And that does mean the government has to look into overregulation, bureaucratic burden, high tax rates in Germany. So we do need a political agenda to make Germany more attractive for investments. But at the same time, we shouldn't forget companies need to adjust to market forces as well.
In concrete terms, though, what should the German government do in these particular cases, Volkswagen, Bosch, BASF?
In these cases, I'm afraid all the government can do is say, OK, these companies need to adjust. Regarding the energy-intensive industries, of course, the German government does need to think about the way it runs energy policy. There's a lot of uncertainty. Germany pursues a very narrow energy policy, focusing exclusively on renewable energies, ruling out nuclear. It's probably time to rethink that strategy because other countries do this differently. But in particular, regarding the car industry, I think what the government can do is limited. It's not nothing. For instance, if we think about charging stations for vehicles, the grid. So we need a more powerful grid because otherwise we won't even be able to have charging stations everywhere. So the infrastructure side is something the government should look into.
OK, so better infrastructure on one side. But if we look at this strategically, is it worth pumping more and more investment into, say, the car sector? Or is there an argument to be made for saying, OK, well, the era of Germany being synonymous with cars is over. Let's find something new to focus on. Let's find a niche where we can really lead again.
Absolutely. Germany will continue to be a place for the production of cars, but this will not be the force driving economic growth. That has to come from somewhere else. Fortunately, Germany does still have a large number of very productive companies, the so-called hidden champions, companies operating successfully in market niches in very different sectors. And I think the challenge is not so much defining which sectors will be successful in the future. That goes wrong if politicians do it, but creating better conditions overall for economic development. And that includes invest into the education system, invest into infrastructure, invest into research and development. Indeed, we do need more new companies. There is a lack in Germany as well as Europe as a whole of newly developing companies, of startup companies that are really successful. So we need to look into the conditions for these newly created companies. We are lacking the markets for capital for these companies. Banks are not very good at financing new companies. We need better tax conditions. We need a different type of labor law. It needs to be more flexible to accommodate these new companies. So startups, new companies can create dynamism, and Europe and Germany needs to embrace that.
Let's look at Europe and Germany together then, and specifically Germany's role within the European Union and the extent to which this is affecting economic performance. If we look at tariffs on Chinese EVs, for example, this is something Germany opposed but was ultimately outvoted on. How do you view this tension between national goals and European cohesion?
Well, I think there are very different views in Europe, for instance, about free trade. There are more protectionist countries. Germany, because of its national economic interest, has been more pro-free trade. And I think Germany should continue to try and convince the partners in Europe that free trade is really what we need. We need free trade externally. Mercosur free trade agreements with Latin American countries are very important and should be signed, but also within Europe. In the last 5 years, the Europeans, the EU has neglected what I think is its greatest assets, and that's the internal market. We have an Ifo study showing that removing obstacles to trade within Europe in services could increase value added by more than 300 billion euros per year. So we do have a growth machine that does not depend on either China or the US, which is the European internal market, but we should use it rather than producing bureaucracy and regulation, which we've done in the last 5 years.
How do you get rid of this regulation? What is it in particular that is holding back the success of this internal market?
I think it's a fundamentally wrong approach the EU has taken in the last 5 years. And that's the idea that we need to regulate the economy so that it becomes more sustainable and regulated in every detail. That has gone wrong. Mario Draghi, in his report on competitiveness, has pointed out that the EU has issued 13,000 acts of legislation in the last 5 years. This is much more than any other country, and it is simply too much. Nobody can follow this legislation. It leads to complete over-regulation, and we need to get rid of this. The EU taxonomy on sustainable finance is a planned economy approach, which is totally misguided. The ESG reporting, the so-called energy efficiency regulation, which is basically a limitation of energy use, is totally misguided because many of the sectors of the future, for instance, artificial intelligence, do need a lot of energy. It doesn't distinguish between green and other types of energy. So a lot of policy errors have been made in the EU. And I'm afraid these can only be corrected if we really abolish this legislation and replace it by more appropriate approaches.
You mentioned that Germany has a favourable approach to the free market, and it sounds like you're saying that the EU is becoming increasingly centrally planned. Does this mean that the solution is more or less of the EU, because this internal market requires excessive cooperation?
I think we need not more or less EU, but the right type of EU. I think the EU does have some approaches to, for instance, to environmental policy, to climate policy, which are very effective, like CO2 pricing. The plan is out there now to extend CO2 pricing to the building sector and traffic. That's exactly right. What we need to get rid of is this over-regulation and this planned economy approach, like in the taxonomy, for instance, defining sectors that are supposed to be sustainable and other sectors that are not supposed to be sustainable. That, for instance, has led to us defining the defense sector as unsustainable, and that now holds back Europe's ability to defend itself. So it's a totally misguided approach to try and define politically which sectors are sustainable and which are not. It's really nonsense, and we should get rid of that as quickly as possible. If not, we are getting ourselves into problems.
When you say sustainable, are you talking about sustainable on an environmental level or on a financial level?
Well, it's not me, it's the EU calling this sustainable, and I think they don't know themselves what they are really talking about. Of course, the idea is mostly about environmental sustainability. Of course, sustainability has the social and governance side, but because this approach is so wrong, my understanding is that the EU has given up on making the same definitions for governance and social. So it has failed in the environmental area and stopped extending this, thank God, to social and governance.
You've mentioned that Germany needs to invest in education and in infrastructure, but you are among those who don't think it should loosen its rules on limiting debt. What is your reason for that, especially when you consider that the debt to GDP ratio in the US, for example, is almost twice as high?
Yes, correct. But the US is an economy growing much more quickly with a different demographic structure. That's why Europe does need, and Germany does need, lower levels of debt. It is important not to confound debt with investment. So if we just relax the debt brake, what we'll get is more consumption, not necessarily more investment. So I think we should start by understanding that for certain types of investment, for instance, replacing our crumbling infrastructure, we need to change the structure of public spending. We cannot do this all on the basis of debt. If we think about education, we cannot use only debt financing to finance this education, because in the long term, I mean, there are so many people retiring, so we are losing human capital, and we are only replacing this by investing more in education, and that has to be done out of current government revenues. I wouldn't rule out debt financing, for instance, for higher military spending, but I think we should first restructure public spending, because issuing debt is very easy. That's why politicians like it. Restructuring public spending is much more fraught with conflict. It's more difficult. Structural reforms that are needed are more difficult, and we shouldn't let politicians get away with just issuing debt. As I said, that's very easy, but that's not the main thing we need.
Let's return to the question of demographics then. This is a problem that's been brewing for a long time. There simply aren't enough workers here. The government has tried to address this with immigration reform. Is there any indication these policies are having an effect?
There is some immigration, and has been quite a lot of immigration in Germany in the last, let's say, decade, and that has helped the labor market. It's not just been immigration of refugees, it's been immigration into the labor market that has helped and will help Germany and Europe in the future. However, for instance, for Germany, some of that immigration came from southern or southeast European countries. And these countries have lost a lot of labor force, and this immigration to Germany is not going to continue. So it is going to be more difficult, to become more difficult to attract people. And that means, yes, immigration has to continue, but we should also try and make more of the domestic labor force. And this is about making sure that it is worth supplying labor, that the incentives are right to work. We need to look into our education system. We need to make sure that people don't retire too early. So there is a lot that can be done.
I want to come back to the retirement question in a minute, but just staying on that immigration reform, one argument I've heard many times is that Germany would be far more attractive to talent if more companies adopted English as a working language. Do you agree with that?
I totally agree. I think a lot of companies have adopted it more or less. Still, there are still people who don't speak English, and it's not always easy to do that. But being more open generally in companies, but also in the public administration, establishing more of a welcome culture, simplifying bureaucratic procedures, these are all things that are very important to make this a place which is attractive for immigrants.
You said you want to make sure that Germans don't retire too early. When is too early, in your opinion?
We currently have a system that moves towards a retirement age of 67. And if that is the effective retirement age, currently it's at 64, that would be progress. This will take some time. What we probably need is not the same retirement age across the board. We need more flexibility. But overall, we should avoid incentives to retire early. And some legislation was introduced in the past, for instance, the pension starting from 63, that worked in the opposite direction. As life expectancy, and to the extent that life expectancy increases, we need to work longer. There's no way around that.
What about the argument that the retirement age should be tied to life expectancy? What do you think about that?
I think that's exactly right. Increasing retirement age shouldn't be the only way of adapting to aging, but it is one very important aspect. And I think following life expectancy is the right approach. That's correct.
But just to clarify, this would be a blanket life expectancy rather than trying to analyze an individual's life expectancy.
Exactly. So we should bear in mind that life expectancy at the moment is different for different parts of the population. For educated people, it's longer than for other people. But what's interesting is not so much the level of life expectancy, but the way it changes over time. And the increase in life expectancy is fairly similar in the population across different parts of the population. And that means we can take this as an orientation for retirement age.
But that difference in life expectancy between educated and less educated people must reflect a great inequality in German society.
I think it reflects an inequality in all societies because we observe it everywhere. It has implications for pension reforms. If we only adjusted to higher pension costs by increasing the retirement age, this would mean we cut pensions for less educated and less well-off people more than for people with a very high level of life expectancy. And that's why pensions also have to adjust by simply holding back the pension level, not only by increasing the retirement age, but retirement age should increase to the extent that life expectancy increases, because that, as I said, increases across all parts of the population.
What about former Finance Minister Christian Lindner's idea to allow the government to use taxpayers' pension contributions to invest in the stock market? Do you think that's a good idea?
Well, I think what's a good idea is to introduce some funding into the system. We have a purely pay-as-you-go pension system, and an aging population, all it can do to assure its pensions is save. So we need to save, individuals need to save, and people, especially with lower incomes, need to save more, but the pension system as a whole can also and should also create reserves. So I think that was a good idea. Was the investment big enough? No, but I think it was a start into the right direction.
Finally, if we look at a much bigger picture, we are living in a time when old certainties about allies and the global order are being completely dismantled. Where should Germany focus its attention when it comes to forging stable economic ties?
I think Germany should try and diversify its economic relations. That's why I say, for instance, improving economic relations and trade with Latin America through Mercosur is a very important step. Some people say we should give up on the model of being an export-oriented economy. I think that's exactly wrong. We need to preserve that because that is one of our strengths, but we need to change it. We have to make sure that we do not depend on too much on individual countries, but diversify our economic relations as far as we can. At the same time, because the world is becoming insecure, there is pressure from Russia and a change in the US regarding the willingness to defend Europe. Germany needs to do more for its defense. Again, I think that means we need to change our priorities in public spending and restructure public spending. We need to do more for defense.
All right. Clemens Fuest, thank you so much.
Thank you.